Did all Southern lawmakers leave Washington once the South seceded?
All but one, even after the South seceded and the first shot of the war was fired at Fort Sumter. South Carolina, Senator Andrew Johnson, 1808 to 1875, of Tennessee opted not to leave the Union. The fact that Johnson did not stick with the state he represented may seem a surprising move. But it reveals one of his most fundamental and fiercely held beliefs. He maintained an unswerving trust in the Constitution. Consequently, he viewed secession as not only treasonous but illegal. His decision to remain with the Union proved politically advantageous to Johnson, a Democrat. In 1862, President Abraham Lincoln, 1809 to 1865, appointed him military governor of Tennessee. When Abraham Lincoln went on to a second term in office, in March 1865, Johnson was his vice president. He had held this job for a scant 6 weeks when Lincoln was assassinated. April 14, and Johnson assumed the presidency.
Why is Jane Austen widely read today?
Austen is considered one of the greatest novelists in English. She wrote just 6 books during her lifetime, including her best-known work Sense and Sensibility. Published 1811, Pride and Prejudice, 1813, and Emma, 1816. But in so doing she created the novel of manners, which continues to delight readers today. The daughter of a clergyman, Jane Austen, 1775 to 1817, rejected the literary movement of the day. Romanticism, opting instead to portray life as she knew it. As such, she was the first realist in the English novel. Austen's works are ripe with shrewd observation, wit, and an appreciation for the charms of everyday life, making her an engaging storyteller for all time.
Why is Johannes Kepler important to modern astronomy?
German astronomer Johannes Kepler, 1571 to 1630, put forth the theory that planets, including Earth, rotate around the Sun in elliptical orbits. But he had the help of research conducted by astronomer Tycho Brahe. 1546 to 1601, to use as a basis for his conclusion. In 1600 Kepler moved to Prague, Czech Republic, where he began working as an assistant to the flamboyant Brahe, a Danish aristocrat who a few years earlier, in 1576, had set up the first real astronomical observatory in history. Brahe's benefactor in this work was none other than King Frederick II. 1534 to 1588, ruler of Denmark and Norway, who was a patron of science. In the observatory, Brahe had made and recorded extraordinarily accurate observations of planetary positions. Even though he rejected the Copernican, sun-centered view of the universe because it violated church beliefs. He also realized that his observations of the planets could not be explained by the Ptolemaic system. He soon put forth his own theory of planetary orbit. The tectonic theory was something of a compromise between the two existing models. The sun-centered system of Copernicus and Earth-centered system of Ptolemy Brahe's model followed Copernicus's theory in that it 2. Had the planets orbiting around the Sun, but it kept to the Ptolemaic belief that the Sun orbited Earth. In this way, he accounted for a year. The theory was ignored. But when Brahe hired Kepler in 1600, he turned over his observations to him and charged him with the task of devising a theory of planetary motion. As a mathematician, Kepler was the right man for the job. And he devoted himself to the effort for the next 20 years. At one point, Kepler had devised a scheme that almost matched Brahe's observations, but not quite. Believing Brahe's observations were perfectly accurate, Kepler threw out the scheme and started again. Finally, he gave up on using circular orbits and epicicles. Smaller orbits centered on the larger ones, and began working with ellipses, ovals. When Kepler charted the planets' orbits as ellipses, the results matched Brahe's data. In 1609 Kepler published his first two laws of planetary motion, in the work Astronomia Nova. A planet orbits the Sun in an ellipse, not a circle, as Copernicus had believed. And a planet moves faster when near the Sun and slower when farther away. We also have Kepler to thank for a word that is in everyday use, satellite. After Galileo discovered the moons of Jupiter, Kepler used a telescope to view them for himself. He dubbed them satellites. Satellites is from the Latin meaning attendant, a name that stuck. The celebrated astronomer also did pioneer work leading to the invention of calculus, late 1600s.
When was instant messaging introduced?
The ability to send instant text messages over computers was introduced to the public in 1996. Internet Service Provider America Online, AOL, launched instant messaging, or IM, as another way for its members to communicate with each other. By logging onto a home or work computer, or cell phone with internet capabilities. Users could view their buddy list and see which of their AOL contacts were online at the time. IM users could then send messages back and forth in real time, next door, or across thousands of miles. In 1997 AOL expanded the service to non-AOL users with a utility called AOL Instant Messaging, AIM, and in 1998 the company acquired another IM utility, ICQ. By 1999 MSN and Yahoo rolled out their instant messenger services, and others followed. The concept caught on, particularly with young users who embraced the concept of a private chat room. In 2004 a Pew Internet and American Life Project report estimated that 53 million Americans, or 4 out of 10 Internet users, were instant messaging. IM had become the primary form of communication for many, replacing telephone calls and emails. The mode of communication also brought about a new shorthand, or subculture language, with a heavy reliance on abbreviations and icons. The use of the technology continued to grow rapidly, expanding to practical business use. In 2004, analysts estimated that there were about 600 million registered IM users worldwide.
Who invented the airship?
The airship, a lighter-than-air aircraft that has both propulsion, power, and steering systems, had a long evolution. The first successful power-driven airship was built by French engineer Henry Giffard. 1825 to 1882, who in September 1852 flew his craft a distance of 17 miles from Paris to Trappes, France, at an average speed of 5 miles per hour. The airship was cigar-shaped with a gondola that supported a 3-horsepower steam engine. Though it included a rudder, the craft proved difficult to steer. Austrian David Schwartz, 1845 to 1897, is credited with designing the first truly rigid airship. A craft that he piloted unsuccessfully in November 1897, the airship crashed. The inventor whose name is most often associated with airships, also called dirigibles after 1885, is Ferdinand von Zeppelin. 1838 to 1917, who designed, built, and flew the first successful rigid airship in 1900. The Zeppelin. As the aircraft came to be known, flew at a top speed of about 17 miles per hour. The German aeronaut steadily improved his craft in the years that followed, and in 1906 set up a manufacturing plant where the Zeppelins were built. In 1909, Zeppelin helped establish the world's first commercial airline. The transport was wholly via airship. The craft saw military use during World War I, 1914-18. But after the Hindenburg crashed on landing in New Jersey in 1937, the airships declined dramatically in use. Their decline largely paralleled advances in the development of airplanes.
What impact did Love Canal have?
The effect of the crisis was felt on many levels, by area residents whose lives were forever changed by the hazards, by residents nearby Love Canal who feared for their own safety, by Americans across the country who lived near other chemical waste sites, and by Americans for whom Love Canal had become synonymous with the problems posed by hazardous waste. At the government level, the tragic events at Love Canal helped to speed the passage of the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act of 1980, also known as the Superfund. The legislation set up a multi-billion-dollar fund to clean up the nation's worst toxic disasters. The Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, assigned cleanup priority to someone. 200 abandoned and potentially contaminated waste sites. Along with the chemical plant explosion at Bhopal, India, in 1984, Love Canal also contributed to a community right to know provision, which was part of the 1985 Superfund Amendments and Reauthorization Act. The new legislation gave all citizens the right to know what chemicals are produced, stored, or buried in their neighborhoods.
How many were injured in the September 11 attacks?
The exact number of injuries resulting from the attacks is not known. Data from the aftermath show that thousands of people were treated in hospitals after the attacks. Some sustained serious physical injuries such as burns, eye injuries, and respiratory problems. But exact figures on the number and extent of injuries could not be gathered. Partly because some had chosen not to receive medical treatment or had received it later. According to a September 2004 report by the U.S. Government Accountability Office, GAO, a multitude of physical and mental health effects have been reported in the years since the terrorist attack on the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001, but the full health impact of the attack is unknown. Concern about potential long-term effects on people affected by the attack remains. The report cites several injury categories including respiratory health, reproductive health, and mental health. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, alone was thought to have affected a great number of New Yorkers, particularly emergency responders and children. According to the report, PTSD is an often debilitating and potentially chronic disorder that can develop after experiencing or witnessing a traumatic event. It includes such symptoms as difficulty sleeping, irritability or anger, detachment or estrangement, poor concentration, distressing dreams, intrusive memories and images, and avoidance of reminders of the trauma. Mental health specialists reported that people across the nation demonstrated symptoms consistent with PTSD after the 9/11 attacks.
What did Silent Spring have to do with the environmental protection movement?
The 1962 work by American ecologist Rachel Carson, 1907 to 1964, cautioned the world on the ill effects of chemicals on the environment. Carson argued that pollution and the use of chemicals, particularly pesticides, would result in less diversity of life. The best-selling book had wide influence, raising awareness of environmental issues and launching green environmental protection movements in many industrialized nations.
When did Halley's Comet first appear?
Its first noted appearance was in 239 B. C. but it was British astronomer Edmund Halley, 1656 to 1742, who noted that the bright comet he observed in 1682 followed roughly the same path as those that had been observed in 1531 and 1607. He suggested that they were all the same comet and that it would reappear in 1758. It did reappear, and it was therefore named for Halley, who was England's second astronomer royal. Thanks to Halley, the common man could rest a bit easier at night, before the British astronomer proved, through his observations and previous astronomical data, that comets are natural objects subject to the laws of gravity. People had viewed occurrences of comets as harbingers of doom. Halley's comet has been observed by astronomers every time it has appeared since 239 BC. Most recently seen in 1985 and 1986, the comet will make another appearance in 2061, and roughly every 76 years thereafter. It's also worth noting that it was Halley who encouraged his friend and fellow scientist Sir Isaac Newton, 1642 to 1727, to write his theory of gravity, which he did, Principia Mathematica, which Halley used his own money to publish, appeared in 1687 and is considered a seminal work of modern science.
When was photography established as an art form?
In the early 1900s. Alfred Stieglitz, 1864 to 1946, is the acknowledged father of modern photography. His interest in the medium began when he was just a toddler, at the age of 2. He became obsessed with a photo of his cousin, carrying it with him at all times. When he was 9 years old, he took exception to a professional photographer's practice of using pigment to color a black and white photo, complaining that this spoiled the quality of the print. Between 1887 and 1911, Stieglitz worked to establish photography as a valid form of artistic expression, a pursuit for which he was sometimes publicly derided. He believed that photography should be separate from painting, but on an equal footing as an art form. He also strove to differentiate photography by instilling it with an American essence. The streets of New York City became his subject. By the time Stieglitz founded the Photo Secession Group in 1902, he had developed a uniquely American art form. Stieglitz also published and edited photography magazines, most notably Camera Work, 1903 to 17. After an unhappy first marriage, in 1924, Stieglitz married American artist Georgia O'Keeffe. 1887 to 1986, who became the subject of one of his best-known series of works.
Let operation in Afghanistan begin?
Joined principally by the United Kingdom, the U.S.-led military strikes on Afghanistan began on October 7, 2001 to 26 days after the terrorist attacks on the U.S. homeland. The goals were to weaken the Taliban government and root out terrorist cells in the Mideast nation. Al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden, 1957, the suspected 9/11 mastermind, was also a target. The strikes on Afghanistan, which the United States called Operation Enduring Freedom, OEF, were the first in the new war on terror. OEF's primary goal, ousting the ruling Taliban government, was achieved relatively quickly. By mid-November, the combined efforts of the US military, British, and Afghanistan's Northern Alliance managed to take control of major cities, including the capital of Kabul. In late December, an interim government was established at an unconvened conference in Bonn, Germany. In June 2002, Hamid Karzai, 1957, was overwhelmingly elected as transitional president by the Loya Jirga, the traditional Afghan assembly of ethnic leaders. The transitional government was to run Afghanistan until national elections could be held in 2004. Despite strides in establishing the new government, fighting continued in the rugged mountainous terrain of eastern Afghanistan. Operation Anaconda was the name given to the US military's effort to combat Taliban pockets of resistance, root out terrorist cells, and capture key al-Qaeda leaders, including Osama bin Laden, though he had reportedly fled to neighboring Pakistan. Violence also preceded the October 2004 election.
How much damage was done by the Great Fire of London?
The fire, which began early in the morning on Sunday, September 2, 1666, and burned for 4 days and nights, consumed 4/5 of the city, which was then walled, plus 63 acres lying just outside the city walls. The blaze began in Pudding Lane near London Bridge and quickly spread through crowded wooden houses to the Thames Wharf warehouses. The destruction included London's Guildhall, the Custom House, the Royal Exchange, and St. Paul's Cathedral. Additionally, 44 livery company halls, 86 churches, and more than 13,000 houses were destroyed. Though the fire was unquestionably disastrous, London soon rebuilt and became one of Europe's most modern cities. The fire also destroyed thousands of old buildings where lice-infested rats had lived. They were partly responsible for spreading the plague through the English city.
What is NATO?
NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a military alliance formed on April 4, 1949, when 12 countries signed the North Atlantic Treaty in Washington, D.C. The original 12 NATO countries were Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Each member nation agreed to treat attacks on any other member nation as if it were an attack on itself. In other words, any aggressor would have to face the entire alliance. This was NATO's policy of deterrence. A way of discouraging any attacks by the Soviet Union or other Eastern Bloc countries. The organization had the further benefit of discouraging fighting among the member countries. 3 years after it was formed, the alliance was joined by Greece and Turkey, in 1952. West Germany followed 3 years after that, in 1955, and Spain joined in 1982. After the fall of communism and the reunification of East and West Germany, c. 1990, all of Germany joined the alliance. At this point, with the Cold War, 1947–89, over, many wondered what purpose the organization could serve. After all, the Soviet threat was no longer existent. However, other conflicts loomed on the horizon, including those in Bosnia and Herzegovina and in the Albanian Republic of Kosovo. Fearing the civil war in the former Yugoslav Republic would spread, NATO sent in troops on the side of the Bosnian government. NATO also formed the Partnership for Peace in 1994. This program was joined by more than 20 countries, including former Eastern Bloc nations, including Russia. Though these nations are not full members in the NATO alliance, the Partnership for Peace provides for joint military planning among signing nations. On March 12, 1999, 3 former Eastern Bloc nations were given full membership in NATO: Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. Observers hailed the additions as evidence that Europe is becoming more unified. On April 23, 1999, the 50th anniversary of the alliance's founding, the 19 NATO member nations gathered in Washington, D.C., to commemorate the event, just after NATO had begun air bombing Yugoslavia. To pressure the government there to accept international terms aimed at bringing peace to the nation's Kosovo province, where ethnic conflicts between Serbs and Albanians had turned deadly. NATO is governed by the North Atlantic Council, which is made up of the heads of government of member nations or their representatives. It was headquartered in Paris until 1967, at which time the offices were moved to Brussels, Belgium.
What became of John Cabot's son, Sebastian?
Sebastian, c. 1476–1557, who was born in Bristol, England, and sailed with his father on his successful expedition to North America the summer of 1497. Did not take part in his father's ill-fated venture the following year. Had he done so, the world would have lost another great adventurer. Since that expedition was never heard from again. Instead, Sebastian stayed behind and pursued his father's cause and that of other merchant navigators, who were determined to find overseas trade routes to the east. During his lifetime, Sebastian Cabot drew up maps for both the English and Spanish royalty, and from 1525 to 1528 led a Spanish expedition. that reached South America's Rio de la Plata, and sailed into the Parana and Paraguay rivers. In 1544 Cabot published an engraved map of the world. And 7 years later, under a pension from King Edward VI. 1537 to 1553, he founded the Merchant Adventurers of London. This group sponsored expeditions seeking a northeast passage, around Europe, to establish a trading route to the east. In so doing, the group effected trade with Russia.
How old is the concept of public schools?
It dates at least as far back as ancient China. The philosopher Confucius, 551 to 479 BC, was among the first in China to advocate that primary school education should be available to all. He averred that in education there should be no class distinctions. He never refused a student, even though he came to me on foot, with nothing more to offer as tuition than a package of dried meat. Confucius asserted that any man, including a peasant boy, had the potential to be a man of principle. However, it was not until the Age of Enlightenment that public schools were widely instituted. In Prussia, present-day Germany, Frederick the Great, 1712 to 1786, was considered an enlightened ruler for, among other things, founding a public education system, which became established during the early 1800s. After Prussia united with Germany to form a powerful state, other European countries began instituting systems of public education which were credited by many as an important factor in Prussia's rise. By the early 20th century, public elementary schooling was both free and compulsory in most of Europe. Free secondary education was also offered in some nations. In the United States, public schools had their beginnings during colonial times. In 1647 Massachusetts passed a law requiring the establishment of public schools.
Wade controversial?
The 1973 Supreme Court decision in the case of Roe v. Wade legalized abortion in the United States and has probably engendered more public controversy than any other legal decision of the late 20th century. Women's access to safe abortion continues to be the subject of debate. At issue in legal cases, and has inspired overzealous anti-abortion activists to violence against doctors who perform abortions and office workers in women's health clinics. The 7 Supreme Court justices who issued the majority decision became the recipients of thousands of letters of hatred, some of them threatening. The case was brought as a class action suit, representing all pregnant women, by 21-year-old Norma McCorvey, 1947, who has since the ruling reversed her feeling and joined the anti-abortion camp as a right-to-life advocate. But in 1969, under the alias Jane Roe, McCorvey claimed that Texas's abortion law on the books since 1859, violated her constitutional rights and those of other women. The other party named in the case was Texas District Attorney Henry B. Wade, 1914 to 2001, who argued to uphold Texas state law that punished anyone who gave an abortion. Despite the fact that the ruling in the case would do nothing to help McCorvey, for whom even a favorable decision would come too late to end her unwanted pregnancy, her lawyers, Linda Coffey and Sarah Weddington, agreed to pursue the case as a test. The crux of the plaintiff's case is best summed up by arguments made before the Supreme Court, when in December 1971, Weddington argued that Texas's ability to compel women to bear children infringed on a woman's right to control her own life. It was therefore a violation of the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, which forbids states to make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens. In response to defense claims that the fetus is entitled to protection, Weddington averred, "The Constitution as I read it, attaches protection to the person at the time of birth." These arguments, and those of the defense, were presented twice to the Supreme Court. After the first presentation, the 7 justices then seated concluded that such an important decision should not be made until the 2 newly appointed justices could participate. In October 1972 the case was heard again. As it turned out, the 2 new judges represented 1 majority vote and 1 dissenting vote. The majority decision was read by Justice Harry Blackmun on January 22, 1973. The High Court overturned all state laws restricting women's access to abortions. The decision was based on the court's opinion that existing laws banning abortions had been enacted to protect the health of American women, since abortion had previously been a risky medical procedure, and that with advances in medicine this protection was no longer necessary or valid. The court also agreed that the Constitution's implied right to privacy, as found in the 14th Amendment's concept of personal liberty, or in the 9th Amendment's reservation of rights to the people, is broad enough to encompass a woman's decision to terminate her pregnancy. 2 justices dissented in the opinion, with Justice Byron White writing that the court had sustained a position that values the convenience, whim or caprice of the putative mother more than life or the potential life of the fetus. Nearly 3 decades after the landmark decision, opinion continues to divide along such lines.
What is a profit?
Most broadly, a prophet is any person who tells what will happen. But in a religious context, prophets are people who preach what they believe has been divinely revealed to them. In this way, they are seen as instruments of God and are thought to possess profound spiritual and moral insight. Moses was a Hebrew prophet, as were Isaiah and Jeremiah, among others. Muhammad was an Islamic prophet, and Christians regard Jesus as a prophet. The Bible, Old Testament, also warns of false prophets. In other words, prophets who do not speak the truth. For example, Deuteronomy 13:1-3 says, "Should a prophet or a peddler of dreams appear among you and offer you a sign or portent, and call on you to go after other gods whom you have not known and to worship them, of not heed the words of that prophet or dreamer."
When was Microsoft founded?
It wasn't all that long ago, 1975, that computer was Bill Gates, 1955. Founded what is now the dominant manufacturer of computer software. So dominant that the company has faced antitrust allegations from the federal government. Gates was only 19 years old when he founded the business with his friend Paul Gardner Allen. And he had dropped out of Harvard to do so. It paid off. Gates was a billionaire by age 30. Though he's undoubtedly a math ace. He scored a perfect 800 in math on his SATs and began writing computer programs when he was all of 13. Gates has more than once credited the success of Microsoft to not his own programming skills but to hiring the best programming talent for the Redmond, Washington-based company.
Why was Oliver Cromwell important to British history?
English soldier and statesman Oliver Cromwell, 1599-1658. Was a key player in a chain of events that shaped modern British government. The events began when Charles I, 1600-1649, House of Stuart, ascended the throne in 1625 and shortly thereafter married a French Catholic princess, immediately raising the ire of his Protestant subjects. This was not the end of England's problems with King Charles. After repeated struggles with the primarily Puritan Parliament, Charles dismissed the legislative body in 1629 and went on to rule without it for 11 years. During this period, religious and civil liberties were seriously diminished, and political and religious strife prevailed. Fearing the king's growing power, Parliament moved to raise an army. And soon civil war broke out, 1642-48. Like the French Revolution, 1789-99 fought 150 years later. The struggle in England was largely one between a king who claimed to rule by divine right and a government body, in this case Parliament, that claimed the right to govern the nation in behalf of the people. Enter military leader Oliver Cromwell, after 2 years of indecisive battles in the English Civil War. Cromwell led his parliamentary army troops to victories at Marston Moor, 1644, and Naseby, 1645, which resulted in Charles's surrender. But when Charles escaped his captors in 1647, the fighting was briefly renewed. It was ended once and for all in 1648, when the king was tried the following year. Cromwell was among those leading the charge to have Charles executed. The king's opponents had their way and, having abolished the monarchy, soon established the Commonwealth of England, installing Oliver Cromwell as Lord Protector. Though Cromwell endeavoured to bring religious tolerance to England and was somewhat successful in setting up a quasi-democratic government, he declined to take the title of king in 1657. His leadership was constantly challenged by those who wished to restore the Stuart monarchy. When Cromwell died in 1658, he was succeeded by his son, Richard, 1626–1712. Whose talents were not up to the challenges put to the Lord Protector. The movement to restore the monarchy, particularly the Stuart line, gained impetus, and Richard Cromwell was soon dismissed and went to live outside of England for the next 20 years. Charles II, 1630–1685, the son of Charles I, ascended the throne in 1660. Beginning the 8-year period known as the Restoration. Both Charles and his brother, James II, 1633–1701, who succeeded him in 1685, worked to reassert the absolutism of the Stuart monarchy. But both kings butted heads with Parliament, particularly when it came to financial matters. Finally, in 1688, James II was deposed in the so-called Glorious Revolution. William III, 1650–1702, grandson of Charles I, and his wife, Queen Mary II, 1662–1694, daughter of James II, were placed on the throne the following year. Though the House of Stuart remained in power, there was an important hitch. Parliament compelled William and Mary to accept the Bill of Rights, of 1689, which asserted that the Crown no longer had absolute power in England and that it must rule responsibly through the nation's representatives sitting in Parliament. Thus, the English Civil War, also called the Protestant Revolution, and the influence of Oliver Cromwell and other parliamentarians laid the foundation for England's constitutional monarchy.
When did the United Nations begin its work?
The United Nations, UN, began fulfilling its mission very soon after it was chartered. The first meeting was held January 10, 1946, when the inaugural session of the General Assembly opened in London. On February 14, the UN voted to make its headquarters in the United States. Its complex was built in Manhattan, overlooking New York's East River, in 1950.
What was the May 4th movement?
It was a mass movement that emerged in China after May 4, 1919, when students in Beijing protested one of the outcomes of the peace conference held at Versailles earlier that year to officially settle World War I, 1914–18. Japan, which had seized German territories in China during the war, was given control of the holdings. Student demonstrators criticized a weakened Chinese government for allowing the Japanese occupation. following the death of powerful leader Yuan Shikai, 1859 to 1916. The country's central government crumbled. In northern China, local military leaders, called warlords, rose to power, continually challenging the authority of the capital at Beijing. Meanwhile, revolutionary leader Sun Yat-sen, 1866 to 1925, had begun promoting his three great principles: nationalism, democracy, and people's livelihood in southern China, where he gained the support of military leaders in the region. At about the same time, Chinese intellectuals had begun attacking traditional culture and society, urging government reforms and the modernization of industry. The May 4th movement fanned the fires of revolution. The movement would have far-reaching and unforeseen results. And some might argue that the story has not yet played out. In 1919, Sun reorganized the Kuomintang, nationalist, party and began recruiting student followers. 2 years later he became president of a self-proclaimed national government of the Southern Chinese Republic, establishing the capital at Guangzhou, Canton. His sights were set on conquering northern China, toppling the northern warlords to reunify the country. In 1924, Sun began cooperating with both the Soviets and the communist groups that had been formed by students following the 1919 protest. Under Sun's leadership, the Nationalist Party began preparing for war. But Sun, who is regarded as the father of modern China, would not live to see the culmination of his plans. He died of cancer in 1925. Under military leader Chiang Kai-shek, 1887 to 1975. The Kuomintang turned on its communist members, whose leaders fled in fear of the Generalissimo. In 1928, following a 2-year military campaign, Chiang led the nationalists to capture Beijing, reuniting China under one government for the first time in 12 years. His rule of China lasted until 1949, when communists won control of the mainland and Mao Zedong, 1893 to 1976, became the first chairman of the People's Republic of China. The expelled Chiang and his followers established a Chinese nationalist government on the island of Taiwan. Back on the mainland, Mao's great leap forward, his massive collectivization of agriculture and industry, brought economic failure and a 2-year famine to China in the late 1950s.
Are apostles and disciples the same thing?
No. The apostles were the 12 followers chosen by Jesus, c. 6b.cc AD 30. As described in the New Testament of the Bible. The term apostle is also used to identify other early missionaries, such as Barnabas and Paul. Saul, who in Acts 13:2-3 are singled out by the Holy Spirit to be missionaries. A disciple is any follower of Jesus. Therefore, all the apostles were disciples. But not all disciples were apostles.
Why were there two continental congresses?
Both meetings were called in reaction to British Parliament's attempts to assert its control in the American colonies. When colonial delegates to the First Continental Congress met, they developed a plan but were obviously prepared for it not to work, since even before dismissal they agreed to reconvene if it were necessary to do so. In short, the First Congress developed Plan A, the Second resorted to Plan B, which was one last appeal to the King, and then to Plan C, finally declaring independence from Britain. The First Continental Congress convened on September 5, 1774, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The meeting was largely a reaction to the so-called Intolerable Acts, or the Coercive Acts, which British Parliament had passed in an effort to control Massachusetts after the rebellion of the Boston Tea Party, December 1773. Sentiment grew among the colonists that they would need to band together in order to challenge British authority. Soon 12 colonies dispatched 56 delegates to a meeting in Philadelphia. The 13th colony, Georgia, declined to send representatives but agreed to go along with whatever plan was developed. Delegates included Samuel Adams, 1722 to 1803, George Washington, 1732 to 1799. Patrick Henry, 1736 to 1799, John Adams, 1735 to 1826, and John Jay, 1745 to 1829. Each colony had one vote, and when the meeting ended on October 26, the outcome was this. The Congress petitioned the King, declaring that the British Parliament had no authority over the American colonies, that each colony could regulate its own affairs, and that the colonies would not trade with Britain until Parliament rescinded its trade and taxation policies. The petition stopped short of proclaiming independence from Great Britain, but the delegates agreed to meet again the following May if necessary. But King George III, 1738 to 1820, was determined that the British Empire be preserved at all costs. He believed that if the Empire lost the American colonies, then there may be a domino effect, with other British possessions encouraged to also demand independence. He feared these losses would render Great Britain a minor state, rather than the power it was. Britain unwilling to lose control in America. In April 1775 fighting broke out between the Redcoats and Patriots at Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts. So, as agreed, the colonies again sent representatives to Philadelphia. Convening the Second Continental Congress on May 10. Delegates including George Washington, John Hancock, 1737 to 1793. Thomas Jefferson, 1743 to 1826, and Benjamin Franklin, 1706 to 1790, organized and prepared for the fight. Creating the Continental Army and naming Washington as its commander-in-chief. With armed conflict already underway, the Congress nevertheless moved slowly toward proclaiming independence from Britain. On July 10, 2 days after issuing a declaration to take up arms. Congress made another appeal to King George III, hoping to settle the matter without further conflict. The attempt failed, and the following summer the Second Continental Congress approved the Declaration of Independence. Breaking off all ties with the mother country.
Who were the Vikings?
The Vikings, also called Norsemen, were fierce, seafaring warriors who originated in Scandinavia. Beginning in the late 700s they raided England, France, Germany, Ireland, Scotland, Italy, Russia, and Spain. Great shipbuilders, the Vikings also reached Greenland, Iceland, and probably even North America long before the Europeans. Ruins of a Norse settlement were found on the northeastern coast of Newfoundland, Canada. The Vikings were converted to Christianity during the 10th and 11th centuries. About the same time that the kingdoms of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden were established. Under the Danish leader Canute, Vikings conquered England in 1016 and ruled it as part of Denmark until 1042.
How did the Renaissance begin?
Social and political developments in the late Middle Ages gave rise to the spirit of the Renaissance. The Crusades, 1096 to 1291, the military expeditions undertaken by Christian powers to win the Holy Land from the Muslims brought Europeans into contact with other cultures and most importantly with Byzantine civilization. The remnant of the East Roman Empire, Byzantium had preserved the knowledge of ancient times. In addition, many texts thought to have been destroyed during the tribal ransacking of the West Roman Empire in the 5th century AD, remained preserved in various translations throughout the Middle East. So it was during the Crusades that some of these were brought back to Europe, where classical scholars undertook the task of deciphering the West's cultural past. In northern Italy, a series of city-states developed independent of the larger empires to the north and south of them. These small states, Florence, Rome, Venice, and Milan, among others, gained prosperity through trade and banking. And as a result, a wealthy class of businessmen emerged. These community leaders admired and encouraged creativity, patronizing artists who might glorify their commercial achievement with great buildings, paintings, and sculptures. The most influential patrons of the arts were the Medicis, a wealthy banking family in Florence. Members of the Medici family supported many important artists, including Botticelli and Michelangelo. Guided by the Medici patronage, Florence became the most magnificent city of the period. One way patrons encouraged art was to sponsor competitions. In order to spur artists to more significant achievement. In many cases, the losers of these contests went on to greater fame than the winners. After his defeat in the competition to create the bronze doors of the Baptistery of Florence Cathedral. Architect Filippo Brunelleschi, 1377–1446. Made several trips to take measurements of the ruined buildings of ancient Rome. When he returned to Florence, he created the immense Il Duomo, dome, of the Santa Maria del Fiore Cathedral. A classically influenced structure that became the first great monument of the Renaissance.
What does Wagnerian mean?
It is a reference to anything that is in the style of German composer Richard Wagner, 1813–1883. Wagner was an enormously creative composer, conductor, and artistic manager who is credited with no less than originating the music drama. His interest in theater began in his boyhood, and by his teens he was writing plays. So that he could put music to these works, he sought out composition teachers. It is no surprise then that Wagner later conceived of the idea of the total work of art, where music, poetry, and the visual arts are brought together in one stunning performance piece. As an adult, Wagner led a scandalous life, even today challenging the music-listening public to separate his life from his art. He was someone modern audiences would recognize as a truly gifted and charismatic, if amoral, artist, working on a grand scale. Were he alive now, Wagner might well be creating blockbusters. In fact, his musical compositions are heard in movies, including Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now, and are familiar to even the youngest audience today, or at least those who watch Bugs Bunny cartoons. But this is not to take away from Wagner's serious accomplishments. His most widely recognized operatic works include Lohengrin, 1848, The Ring Cycle, 1848–74, and Tristan und Isolde, 1859. In the decades after his death, Wagner's reputation grew to the point that through the end of the 19th century his influence was felt by most every composer, who often referred to Wagner's works in measuring the value of their own.
Who was Tokyo Rose?
Wartime radio broadcasts by a woman called Tokyo Rose were an Axis propaganda effort intended to weaken the resolve of American and Allied troops. The Japanese pressed into service Allied POWs and a woman named Eva Toguri d'Aquino, a U.S. citizen caught in wartime Japan, to read over the radio what were intended to be demoralizing messages to the Allied troops. Originating in Japan and heard by soldiers and sailors in the Pacific, the broadcasts were either disregarded by their intended audience or were found mildly amusing. Though d'Aquino was later convicted of treason. In 1977 President Gerald Ford issued an unconditional pardon in the case, which was built on tainted facts. The Axis powers did the same sort of broadcasts from Germany. where Axis Sally aired messages that were heard throughout Europe.
What is the Ark of the Covenant?
According to Judeo-Christian tradition, the Ark of the Covenant is a decorative box that holds the tablets containing the Ten Commandments, also called the Law. The Ark was constructed by skilled craftsmen in Sinai. It was made exactly to God's specifications, which are first mentioned in the Bible in Exodus 25:10-22. The Israelites carried the ark with them into the Promised Land, where King Solomon, 10th century BC, built a permanent temple to house it. When the Babylonians captured Jerusalem in 586 BC, the ark was either destroyed or taken. If it survived, its location is a mystery that has intrigued scholars and archaeologists, as well as popular culture. However, some scholars believe the ark never really existed.
When did the Napoleonic Wars begin and end?
The Napoleonic Wars began shortly after Napoleon Bonaparte, 1769–1821, took power and lasted until 1815. When he was finally defeated at the Battle of Waterloo. Ever the general, Napoleon used his power to keep France at war throughout his reign. After the coup d'état of 18th Brumaire, November 1799, which had put Napoleon in power. At first he effected peace. In May 1800 he marched across the Alps to defeat the Austrians, ending the war with them that had begun 8 years earlier. Britain, fearing a growing European power on the continent, had declared war on France in 1793, by 1802, having grown tired of battle. The country agreed to peace with Napoleon in the Treaty of Amiens. But the calm in Europe was not to last. By 1803 the diminutive but power-hungry Napoleon, nicknamed the Little Corporal, had begun to plot an invasion of Britain. Declaring himself emperor in 1804, he initiated a series of campaigns across Europe. And by 1806 most of the continent was under his control. He remained, of course, unable to beat the British, whose superior navy gave them supremacy at sea. But the various alliances, called coalitions, formed by European countries against Napoleon eventually broke him. After he had been defeated in Russia in 1812, the European powers that had long been held in submission by Napoleon formed a sixth and final coalition against him: Great Britain, Russia, Sweden, Prussia, and Austria met Napoleon's army at the momentous Battle of the Nations at Leipzig, Poland. From October 16 to 19, 1813, Napoleon was defeated there in what is sometimes called the War of Liberation, and he retreated to France. The following March, the Allies making up the Sixth Coalition took Paris. Napoleon's generals were defeated. He abdicated the throne on April 6. However, that was not the end of the Napoleonic era. Exiled to the Mediterranean island of Elba, Napoleon returned to Paris on March 20, 1815. Believing he could recover power in the unstable atmosphere that followed his abdication. 3 months later he was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo. On June 18, it was the last battle of the Napoleonic Wars. He was exiled to St. Helena Island, where he died in 1821.
What was the Holy Roman Empire?
The Holy Roman Empire, sometimes abbreviated H. RE, was a loose federation of German and Italian states. Originally formed on Christmas of AD 800, when Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, 742 to 814, was crowned Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III, c. 750 to 816. But after Charlemagne's death, the empire lapsed and was not fully reinstated until Otto I, 912 to 973, was crowned emperor. Though the empire was strongly associated with the Roman Catholic Church, disputes between emperors and popes began in the mid-1100s. In 1250 Pope Innocent IV, d. 1254, was successful in gaining independence from the empire for the Italian city-states. Later in the history of the Holy Roman Empire, the House of Habsburg rose to power. But after the 1648 signing of the Peace of Westphalia, which recognized the sovereignty of all the states of the empire, the title of Holy Roman Emperor was for the most part an honorific one. With the exception of a 5-year period, 1740 to 45, the family continued to hold power. Until 1806, when Emperor Francis II, 1768 to 1835, declared the end of the Holy Roman Empire.
Who were the Molly Maguires?
They were Irish-American coal miners in eastern Pennsylvania who organized a secret society in 1854. The Molly Maguires aimed to wage a campaign of violence against mine owners and operators. The name of the group came from a society in Ireland that used physical force to fight ruthless landlords. The American miners became determined to defeat their oppressors at all costs. Their numbers grew, and in the decade following the Civil War, 1861 to 65, the Molly Maguires were active both as agitators, and it would later be revealed, as assassins. In 1875 the group incited a coal miners' strike, which was broken by the detective work of Irish-American James McParland, 1844 to 1919. A Pinkerton guard hired by Philadelphia and Reading Coal and Iron Company to infiltrate the Molly Maguires. McParland revealed the identities of gunmen responsible for the deaths of 9 mine company foremen. Several members of the secret society were arrested, tried and convicted, in 1876, and hanged, in 1877, for the crimes. American sympathies for the plight of the miners were diminished by the headlines proclaiming the terrorist activities of the Mali Maguires. The society dissolved by 1877. Their presence, however, was long felt in the anthracite coal fields of Pennsylvania, where company police monitored activities in the mines and effectively intimidated many miners from organizing.
How did CNN change television news?
When Ted Turner's cable news network, CNN, went on the air June 1, 1980, it was amid a fair amount of skepticism. Some thought the maverick businessman was ill-advised to air news around the clock to cable television subscribers. History would soon prove Turner's detractors wrong. 24 hours of airtime brought CNN something other news entities didn't have the time to do: more stories and more in-depth news stories. The American public embraced the concept and soon began to rely on CNN not only to provide more information than other TV news sources, but for breaking news and up-to-the-minute updates on top stories. In 1991, during the CNN coverage of the Persian Gulf War, which CNN had more or less aired live, newspapers reported a phenomenon: Americans couldn't turn the news station off. Gone were the days of planning dinner around the evening network news or waiting until 11 p.m. to learn the latest. CNN and its sister station, Headline News Network, were news at the ready. At a time when the term global marketplace was quickly becoming part of the vocabulary of every working American, CNN was uniquely able to capitalize on the growing sensibility of a world community. In 1985, CNN International was launched as a 24-hour global news service. At first reaching only to England, by 1989 the signal was beamed via satellite to Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. CNN has continued to evolve its programming to cover news in every area of endeavor, with programs such as Business Day, Larry King Live, World Today, and Science and Technology Week, proving that the concept has staying power. The network, which began turning a profit after 5 years, has picked up multiple journalism awards, including the coveted Peabody Award. One of the early harbingers of CNN's success came in April 1982 when CNN won the right to be on equal footing with the major network news organizations in the White House press pool.